So welcome everyone. Thank you for those of you who took the time to tune into this webinar. We're very excited about the topic today. So just to provide a little bit of background, this is a product of our joint Henry Ford Health and MSU collaboration that started in 2021 with plans to set a trajectory towards a bold vision to discover and advance a new standard of health. And we're doing that by approaching 4 different pillars including research, health equity, education, as well as the battle against cancer. This webinar is going to be focusing on health equity as well as evolving education. So the topic that we're going to be discussing today is balancing patient welfare and workplace safety. So for many of us who are on the line right now, we know that workplace violence in healthcare is a pervasive issue. And it not only affects the faculty and many of us who work with patients, but the quality of care that our patients receive. So in this session, we're going to explore the intersection of workplace violence and health equity together. And the ultimate goal is creating a safer, more inclusive healthcare system. So when we were developing this webinar, we really wanted to make sure that you had concrete tools to leave with and to put into practice the next time you interact with your patients. So upon completing this webinar, you will hopefully have a better sense of the unique issues healthcare workers face when addressing workplace safety issues, the unique challenges at-risk individuals encounter upon entering the criminal system, as well as concrete steps that providers can take to make the healthcare setting safer for both patients as well as providers. So you can receive various credits for attending this webinar. There is CME and CNE credit available. We want to make sure that you receive these. So to do this, you just have to participate, attend this webinar, as well as it will need to be completion of a post-session evaluation and survey, and that will be at the conclusion of this session. If for some reason you don't make it to the end of the session, there will be an email sent out tomorrow with this post-survey as well. So make sure you complete that again to receive your credit. Additionally, in the state of Michigan, it is a requirement that healthcare providers do complete implicit bias training, and this workshop will fulfill that criteria. We really want to make sure that you get that credit. So right now, you can actually do the pre-assessment. It is 1 question. You can use the QR code on the screen if you have your phone available. And again, you can do that right now. Or if you don't have a phone available, there's an evaluation link. So you can either copy and paste that or click on that to answer that 1 question. In addition to this pre-assessment question, there will also be a post-session evaluation, which again will just consist of 1 question following the webinar. If you have any issues with any of this, please just write it in the chat so we can make sure that we're addressing that in real time. All right, so this webinar today is part of a series. So this is going to be addressing at-risk communities in context, so challenges faced and provider responses to patient violence. We do have built-in Q&A portions of this webinar, and that is very intentional because we want to hear your voice, we want to hear your opinions and your questions. So you don't have to wait to the Q&A to type in your questions. What we're hoping is that you'll type it in while the speakers are talking. So by the time we get to these Q&A sections, we'll have a number of questions and comments to go through at that time. And then if you do find the session valuable, look out for announcements for part 2 as well as part 3, because they will also be pertaining to workplace violence in the healthcare setting, but they'll be looking at different aspects of it. All right, a couple other housekeeping items. We just wanted to acknowledge Drs. Eric Scher and Aaron Sousa, who chair the joint HFH and MSU Education Committee, for their support in putting this webinar together, as well as acknowledge our committee members in interprofessional education, as well as faculty development, again, who contributed to this session. And then with no further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. So our first speaker for today is Trevor Gardner. He received a J.D. from Harvard Law School and a Ph.D. from the Department of Sociology at UC Berkeley, with a primary focus on social theory. He went on to work in Trial Division of the District of Columbia Public Defender Service before leaving criminal practice for the world of academia, where Trevor has contributed to the educational missions at both Washington University and is now at St. Louis University, where he is a tenured professor and the Vice Dean of Research. His research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the University of Michigan Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, the UC Berkeley Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, and the Washington University Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity. Trevor Gardner's research addresses various issues in crime governance with a primary focus on police. He has written extensively on the relationship between federalism and police administration. Trevor's scholarship has appeared in the Columbia Law Review, the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, the Yale Law Journal, the Stanford Law Review, and the Boston University Law Review. It is also our distinct pleasure to have Professor Ji Seon Song, who obtained her J.D. from Columbia University School of Law and an LLM from Georgetown University Law Center. Professor Song's teaching and research focuses on criminal law, criminal procedure, and policing. Her scholarship examines the deployment of policing authority and corresponding effects on racial, minority, and other marginalized groups. Her research informs interventions that addresses race and class-based disparities in policing practices. Professor Song regularly conducts trainings and provides consultation for medical providers on the intersection of medical care and policing. She is also a well-known advocate for local, regional, and national juvenile justice reform. She has published extensively in medical journals on the topic of workplace violence in the healthcare setting and the interface with vulnerable patient populations. So with no further ado, I'm going to let our speakers take over. I will stop sharing and allow them to bring up their presentations, and I look forward to a great learning experience. Thank you.
Okay. It's great to be with you this afternoon again, as Dr. Gray meant. Thank you for the kind introduction, by the way. As Dr. Gray mentioned at the opening of the presentation, we're here to discuss a topic that I think is of deep interest to healthcare providers, namely the safety and security of both at-risk patients and providers in the healthcare setting. So I'm going to jump forward on the slide deck. I'm going to go all the way to the overview, and I want to talk a little bit more about where we're headed. So we've broken the webinar into three parts. In part one, we're going to begin by considering the safety risks that providers face in the healthcare setting, as well as at-risk patients within the larger context of the criminal justice system. So you might think of part one as providing maybe helpful context by which to consider how to best achieve a safe work environment in the healthcare setting. We'll then turn to part two. In part two, we'll talk about how providers can best respond to patient violence. Now, I should emphasize that our role is not necessarily to dictate to you best practices in the healthcare setting. You all are much more familiar with that setting than I am. Professor Song has spent considerable time in that setting, but I see our role as giving you as providers a better sense of the costs and benefits of various responses to unruly patients and patient violence. So we're ultimately, you might consider us as ultimately offering a framework, scaffolding that you can use to make informed decisions in pursuit of workplace safety. We'll ultimately close in part three, again, three parts with a series of action items. So what concrete steps can we take as providers to achieve workplace safety while minimizing risks to at-risk patients? So again, in sum, we're talking about a three-part presentation on safety in the healthcare setting. And as Dr. Gray mentioned, we'll have 10 minutes after each part for Q&A. So let's turn to part one. Talking now about at-risk communities in context, challenges faced by providers, and responses to patient violence. So I want to begin with a little bit of background on workplace violence, specifically violence in the healthcare setting. So how should we think about crime and violence in the healthcare setting specifically? So first, as many of you already know, research indicates that the healthcare setting is subject to a relatively high rate of violent crime. I think it's important to establish that at the outset, that the healthcare setting is sort of unique in this sense among workplace environments. It's exceptional. I also want to note that there's evidence indicating an exception within this exception, right? What do I mean by that? Personnel in psychiatry and in the emergency department, these two units, are more likely than providers in other healthcare settings to be subject to workplace violence. So again, we've established at the top that healthcare workers are more likely to be subject to workplace violence. You might be thinking, you're telling me something I already know. Can we be a little bit more specific, a bit more granular? In fact, we can. So a few additional statistics that I think are relevant. Healthcare providers are 5 times more likely than the average worker to experience workplace violence. And we also know that healthcare workers only report a portion of the violent incidents that occur in their workplace setting. One final note, it's important to recognize that when tabulating incidents, of workplace violence in the healthcare setting, we're not just talking about patient on provider violence. These tabulations of workplace incidents, the rate of workplace violent incidents, I should say, also include violent incidents between healthcare providers. All right. A few more, I think, important statistics. If we're talking about the emergency department in particular, I know many of you work in emergency units. 91% of patients, 91% of physicians reported that in the prior year they had been threatened or attacked at work. 71% of this population said that workplace safety the situation, their work environment was deteriorating from the standpoint of safety and security. And 70% of this same respondent pool traced violent incidents to mental health crises. So again, I imagine that this last stat might resonate with many of you who are in the healthcare setting, those who interact with folks struggling with mental health issues on a regular basis. Just in terms of this particular survey, these physicians suggested that much of this was attributable to mental health patients. So I imagine they're likely to be front of mind. What else should we say? What else can we contemplate? Should we contemplate in terms of workplace violence in the healthcare setting? Well, I think it's important to recognize that people think about violence differently. When I say people, I mean public generally, but we might also think about researchers, right? We have these statistics, many of which I just conveyed to you, that are essentially about the elevated level of violence in the healthcare setting. But the question is, what do we mean by violence? And at this point, some of you might be thinking, well, that's sort of obvious. I know what violence is. We talk about it a lot in the public square and public discourse. And many of us think violence is some form of physical contact where the person initiating the contact intends to injure, another person. But I think it's important to recognize that researchers of the workplace setting and researchers of workplace violence generally use a different, broader definition of violence. So these researchers, students of the workplace, they generally define violence such that it includes the infliction of both physical and psychological harm, right? So we see in the overhead a definition that is even more expansive, including intentional infliction of moral and social harm. So while that might not comport with, let me jump to the next slide, that might not comport with our sort of conventional, common, everyday definition of violence. I think it's important to recognize that researchers define violence as a general matter more expansively. So say someone is subject to, let's say a provider is subject to a racial epithet in the context of the healthcare setting. That would likely be recorded in this research paradigm as psychological abuse and therefore an act of violence. So again, something to keep in mind moving forward. I wanted to sort of look at this again on a granular level, looking specifically at the definition of workplace violence as put forward by the World Health Organization. So this is, I would imagine, among the most influential institutions in healthcare. The World Health Organization defines violence as the following: incidents where staff are abused, threatened, or assaulted in circumstances related to their work. Well, that seems conventional. And then we also have the second piece, which is a nod to this more expansive definition. Although a single incident can suffice, psychological violence often consists of repeated, unwelcome, unreciprocated, and imposed upon action. And I'll move my head just a bit here, apologies, which may have a devastating effect on the victim. So We've established one that the healthcare setting is subject to a high level of violence, and then two, that the researchers are defining violence fairly expansively. All right, now I want to talk just very briefly about potential responses to workplace violence. So you're in the healthcare setting, you are encountering an unruly patient. You may be encountering a violent patient. What are your options? I'm not going to delve too deeply into these options. We'll turn back to these options in part 3, but I want to put these options on the table, and I want you to keep them in mind moving forward, because I think the context we're providing over the course of the presentation will, I want you to think about these options in relation to the larger context that we'll be highlighting. So one, you can handle the incident informally with coworkers. Two, you can do nothing. Let's say you conclude this is not a big deal. You decide not to take formal action. Three, you can call security, right? You can get assistance in stabilizing the situation from security that's on site. Four, you can write a report, let's say, and deliver it to a supervisor. And five, you can call the police. I want us to remember that all of these are reasonable responses depending on the circumstances. But again, I want you to keep each of these options in mind as we, such that we can revisit them in part 3, and consider your sense of the appropriate response given all the background information that we've shared along the way. Okay, let's jump to the next slide. So we're going to talk for a moment about, again, about context, shifting from workplace violence in the healthcare setting to talking specifically about the experience, the everyday experience of at-risk communities, individuals, and communities in the criminal justice system. So here we'll just discuss 4 topics. 1, incarceration nationally. 2, violent crime nationally, something that's always of interest. 3, misdemeanor criminal enforcement, and 4, criminal procedures. All right, so in terms of incarceration, what's important here? Well, I want to give you a little bit of historical context. Between 1925 and 2012, you can see with your own eyes the rise in the incarceration rate, right? We took an astronomical rise in incarceration. We're talking about jailings, imprisonments, beginning in the 1970s, reached a peak at about 2009. We're still at a very high level historically. So I would just want to sort of reference in passing the exceptional number of people by historical standards living in jails and prisons. I also want to convey to you that we're also exceptional in the US in terms of our incarceration rates relative to peer nations. So what do I mean by peer nations? Here you want to think about nations like Australia, Britain, France, etc. You might be asking, well, we might talk about rates of imprisonment, but let's also talk about rates of crime itself. So crime did go up for several decades between 1960 and, as you can see in the graph, 1990. But crime has gone down precipitously over the past roughly 30 years or so, something to keep in mind moving forward. So let's say you call the police, they come to your work setting, they decide to make an arrest, they take the individual to jail. Well, how does that, how do we, what's the context by which to understand how that person going to jail fits in the larger criminal justice system? Well, most people who are in prison, are incarcerated, are in state prisons, right? You go to state prison when you've been sentenced to incarceration for over a year. Otherwise, you're going to jail. If you're sentenced under a year, to less than a year in prison, you're going to jail. Now, if you're merely arrested, you're likely going to jail, maybe just for a night or two. It's important to understand how the jail population fits into this larger population of incarcerated people. Along this line, I also want to give you a sense of the total number of people incarcerated. Didn't mention this earlier, but we have about 1.7 people in the U.S. living in jails and prisons. About 3.75 million people under probation or parole. I offer the probation and parole number in part to convey to you that we have about just over 6, not over 6, I'm trying to get my math right, over 5 million people, close to 6 million people subject to what we would call criminal supervision. So they're either in jail, in prison, on parole, or on probation. And that's about the size of the state of Ohio. So if you want to imagine the size of the population under criminal justice supervision, just think about the state of Ohio, its total population. All right, so shifting from just bare facts in terms of the incarcerated population, how does this relate to your at-risk patients? And I think this is fairly important. I'm going to focus on the graph on the right-hand side. So what do we take from this graph exactly? Well, we have a sense based on this graph of what people were earning in terms of income in the 3 years prior to, or 3 years prior to their incarceration. And what we see from the graph is that, almost none of the people subject to incarceration were making more than $50,000 a year, right? You see $50,000 on the far right hand of the graph. A small percentage of incarcerated folks, people in jail or prison, were making between maybe $15,000 and $25,000 prior to entering prison. And we all obviously know that the vast majority, based on the distribution, the vast majority of people in jail or prison either had no earnings just before entering prison or earned less than $15,000 prior to incarceration. All right, so what does this tell us? What do we deduce from this? Well, very, very few middle class and upper class folks are subject to incarceration, right? The vast majority of the incarcerated population are people living well below the poverty, living, I should say, at or below the poverty line. And I think this is one of the more interesting slides that I'll put in front of you this afternoon, and it gives us an opportunity to drill down here. So we break things down by race and education. We want to think about education here as a proxy for class, right? Social scientists often use education level as a proxy for class because class measures can be somewhat funky. In any event, we get a better sense of the relationship between incarceration and at-risk communities based on this slide. So I want to direct your attention to two parts of the slide. And again, forgive me for the size of my head. Sometimes it's regrettable. Did not plan to place my head just in front of the important part of the slide. In any event, on the far right-hand corner of the slide, you have Blacks with no college education. And we can compare that population in terms of their incarceration rate in 1979, right, roughly 50 years ago, and in 2009. And you see, and what does this tell us? Well, 69% of Black Americans without a high school diploma are going to spend some time incarcerated, right? As compared to 15% back in 1979. So we know that based on this slide, there's a racial dimension to incarceration. But I think what's really interesting here is that clearly the number of Black people with no high school education, or no diploma, much larger than the white population. But what's really interesting here, if you look closely at the white population with no high school diploma, their numbers have risen dramatically as well. And so pales in comparison to Blacks, but take a close look. If you're a white person with no high school diploma, right, the likelihood of, we can say the percentage incarcerated at some point in their lives jumped from 4% in 1979 to 15.3%, right? That's growth of almost 400%. So is there a racial dimension to incarceration? Absolutely. Is there a class dimension to incarceration apart from the racial dimension? Absolutely. And so these are factors that we want to consider as we contemplate what's the best way to respond to these incidents in the healthcare setting. All right, we have just a few minutes left. I'm going to jump forward a couple slides. I want to talk about violent crime in the U.S. We talked about violent crime in the healthcare setting, but I think it's really important to have a sense of violent crime in the U.S. The U.S. is a uniquely violent society. What do I mean by that? Our violent crime rates exceed that of other wealthy nations, generally we refer here to Europe. So you don't want to lose track of that fact. What else do we know about crime, though? Crime in the U.S., violent crime and property crime have fallen dramatically since the 1990s, right? So we had a lot of discourse, especially in politics, about the problem of violent crime. And, you can tell based on the graphs here that even though we have the huge drop, there are slight upticks, and then the rate falls back down. But it's important to know that over the course of the past ha 30 years or so, 35 years, violent crime has fallen dramatically, right? Precipitous decline. What else do we know about violent crime? Well, if we want to talk not historically, but just about violent crime in the past year or so, between 2020, I mean, we're at the end of 2024, but I'll just note that between 22 and 2022, excuse me, and 2023, homicides went down, ag assaults went down, robberies went down very, very slightly, and then burglaries went down. And again, I see that I just have a couple minutes here. Want to convey that motor vehicle theft increased substantially over this period. You can see by 12.6%. So that's also important to note. All right, so you have the backdrop. I might flip through just a few slides, but we still have some time left in terms of part one, but we will be turning to Q&A in the next few moments. So what am I trying to convey here? I mean, I am conveying, one, that the U.S. is unique in terms of its level of violent crime, but two, violent crime has fallen precipitously over the last 30 years, and three, what I want to convey with this slide is that people don't have a good sense of the decline in violent crime over the past few decades. And so if you look at this slide, what's really interesting here is that people are generally concerned about violent crime, but they tend to believe, as indicated by the slide, that crime is up nationally and less so locally. But what do we glean from this? What do we take away from this? People have a better sense. They have a more accurate sense of the violent crime rate locally because they live in their local environments than they do nationally. And so we often get swept up in national discourses about the violent crime problem. But as you can tell by comparing the prior slides to this slide, we often end up in a misperception as to the true rate of violent crime. Okay, few more points about the criminal enforcement context. And I think these next few slides are more relevant to the healthcare setting. So I want to sort of give you a little bit of information about, let's say, the relative gravity of various criminal offenses. So we have misdemeanors on the one hand, felonies on the other. If we're talking about misdemeanor crime, what does that mean? What's the difference between a misdemeanor and felony? If we were in a lecture hall, I'd probably reach out into the audience. We aren't, so I'll have to answer the question myself. A misdemeanor is a crime in which the maximum penalty is less than a year in jail or prison, less than a year of incarceration. Well, what's a felony, on the other hand? A felony is considered a major crime, with the misdemeanors being a minor crime, right? So the felony, the penalty for a felony, the maximum penalty is well above a year. That's the distinction, right? If the maximum penalty in terms of incarceration is a year or less, it's a misdemeanor, considered a minor crime. If it's a year or more, it's considered a felony. Why am I telling you this? Well, what we don't realize if we're talking about the scope, the scale of criminal justice, is that 80% of the criminal docket is made up of misdemeanor crimes. Well, what's a criminal docket? If you go to a given courtroom, if you look at all of the criminal cases in that courtroom, 80% of the cases are going to be minor crimes, right? What am I trying to convey here? The vast majority of cases, criminal cases, are minor crimes as opposed to major crimes. And so I think that's also important context, especially in light of the incarceration problem. I'm going to take a few more minutes but before I close this section. One thing we want to remember, though, is there's a huge racial disparity in terms of misdemeanor criminal enforcement. And I have a quote here from a prominent law article about misdemeanors. We see, Black folks in particular, arrested for misdemeanors, charged with misdemeanors, tried for misdemeanors at a rate that exceeds whites. And one study, the one referenced here in the overhead and the slide, finds that this is true across all of the offense types that they studied in every jurisdiction that they studied. What else is helpful to know about misdemeanors? I just want to make one other point. It's sort of highlighted at the bottom of the slide. If we talk about discrimination in the context of criminal justice, one thing I convey to my students in criminal procedure is that police and prosecutors have far more discretion regarding minor offenses than they do major offenses. Well, why is that relevant here? It's relevant because different from offenses like homicide or kidnapping or robbery or burglary, uh, uh, where police and prosecutors don't have much discretion. They're considered serious crimes, and they don't. When I say they don't have discretion, what I mean is that they don't have much flexibility in terms of how they treat the case. But they have a lot of discretion when it comes to misdemeanor charging and conviction. And that's when biases can either class biases or race bias, that's when they can creep in. So now we're going to talk about responding to patient violence, and we're turning from the unique issues faced by healthcare workers, or turning to, excuse me, the unique issues faced by healthcare workers, as well as various police procedures that you might witness if police come on the scene in response to an unruly patient or an incident of violence. Um, So I mentioned the rate of incarceration, but if we think about incarceration going up over the past 100 years or so, we want to think about police procedures as being sort of the predicate to incarceration, right? So what are the actions they take in the field? Well, for every instance of incarceration, you have an arrest, right? The incarcerated population, the vast majority of them were arrested, right? And of all the entire population of arrest, you have a larger population of police stops. Those are formal forced detentions. And in terms of all the entire population of police stops, every stop was a function of some form of observation or surveillance by police. So you see how incarceration is just a smaller circle or smaller. Yeah, so we'll just talk about it in terms of circles, a smaller circle within sort of a larger field of police activity. Um, so you might be asking, why did he just walk us through this Venn diagram? Again, just to show that the scale of the system and police procedures in the context of the scale of the system. All right, let's talk specifically. I think this will be more interesting. Let's talk specifically about police encounters. And so there are generally three types of police encounters. Not that any of you are interested in law school, lawyers, boo, I know how this goes, but on one slide, you'll see that in criminal procedure, you'll see the slide in criminal procedures classes. And I think it's a really important slide because a police officer comes into your workplace setting. You might think, well, what is the police officer going to do? What's likely to happen? And so a lot of times police come on the scene, similar to security guards. They're just looking to secure the scene, right? And they engage with the let's say unruly person in somewhat casual fashion, and we would consider this a consensual encounter. What does that mean? The police officer is just engaging that person to settle down the situation, and the person can leave at their discretion, right? They're not obligated to stay there in the presence of the police officer. Then we have a police stop, right? What's a police stop? Well, a police stop is a little bit different, right? That's a non-consensual temporary detention. If a police officer engages in a formal stop, that means you have to stop, right? They have the authority in some circumstances to force you to stop and talk to them so they can do an additional investigation to figure out what's going on. And then finally, we have the arrest, right? An arrest is considered an indefinite detention as opposed to a temporary detention. That means the police officer is again placing you under arrest. What does that mean? They are, excuse me, detaining you for an indefinite period of time. What's the use of sort of walking through these three types of encounters? Well, I think it's important to recognize that the police have to establish by law different levels of suspicion for each encounter. So if you're trying to figure out what's going on when a police officer steps onto the scene, this gives you a little bit more background, right? More context in terms of the law. So we're talking again about the first encounter, a consensual encounter. The police officers don't need any sort of suspicion, right? No suspicion required. They don't have to establish anything first before just approaching you to talk to you, right? And we all have experiences with police officers in this particular manner. I asked a police officer for directions. A police officer asked me a question about whether I saw what just happened. These are consensual encounters in which the police officer is approaching me, and I can leave if I want to. I can answer questions if I want to. It's all up to me. But if we get to a police stop, it's not all up to me. The police officer can, in some instances, ask me to, not ask me, but direct me to stop, and he can detain me. He can even put handcuffs on me for this temporary detention. What's the purpose of a temporary detention? Police officer is doing conducting a bit more research, excuse me, is investigating a bit further to figure out what in the world is going on. The key here, and this is the point I want to make clearly, the key here is that the police officer has to have reasonable articulable suspicion in order to stop someone, right? In order to forcibly detain them for a temporary period. Well, what does that mean, right? It sounds like legal mumbo jumbo. A reasonable articulable suspicion, if I was to boil it down to accessible language, that's simply the police officer establishing that there's a credible reason to believe that the person targeted committed a criminal offense. If the police does not have a credible reason to believe they committed a credible offense, the officer cannot engage in this forced stop. So what does that mean for an arrest? Well, again, an arrest is a forced detention, and it's an indefinite detention. What do we mean by indefinite? The person could be detained up to 48 hours before seeing a judge. If the police are executing this more serious form of action, they need probable cause, right? What does probable cause mean? It's a higher level. It's a higher level of suspicion than that credible reason. They need to establish that, you know, they probably did it, right? More likely than not that this particular person committed this particular crime. So just remember that there are these levels of suspicion that police are going to establish, that they have to establish by law in order to engage in these specific acts, either a stop or an arrest. Also remember that consensual encounters where the person can just walk away from the officer if they want to, no suspicion required for the police officer to just walk up to you and ask you questions. Okay, I am going to turn things over to Ji Seon at this point. Ji Seon is going to finish out part 2. And we'll jump to the Q&A. To do that, I'll have to collapse my slide deck, and Ji Seon will, Professor Song, excuse me, will upload her own. And Ji Seon, I think you may be
unmuted. I'm unmuted. Can people see my screen? I'm also, San Francisco is in the middle of some crazy weather, so my internet keeps going off. So I've hotspotted to my phone. I will do my best. Let's just all send good vibes out that I continue to stay connected to all of you. So thank you so much for having me. And, you know, now that you're all experts in the criminal justice system, I know that that was a lot, but the reason why we thought that it was important to start with that is because if you look at these potential responses to workplace violence, handle it informally, do nothing, call hospital security, make a report, and then call the police, this last one, in some ways, is most consequential, not just to the patient because the patient's liberty interests are at stake, they get arrested, but it's also really a consequential decision for you as a healthcare provider when you think about your medical ethics and about your own concerns about patient care. So in this next section, we're going to concentrate specifically on this last option. And the reason being because the decision to call police into the healthcare setting implicates patient care, provider ethics, and has important legal consequences. And so some of these concerns, right? So I'm giving you, I mean, you may have many more, but these are some that I'm listing. So police, the reason you're calling police in because they bring a sense of security and safety, right? So because the police come, they are handling the immediate sense of crisis. But there's also the flip side. And I saw actually a participant question. So but calling the police may actually cause you anxiety because of your prior experience. Like, let's say you're also of a racial minority group that has had negative police experiences. And so it might be something that that also might be at play. The police involvement may cause harm to your patient, maybe not immediately or immediately at the very moment of the police intervention, or because of jail and incarceration. And you may be very familiar with your local jail facility because you see the after effects of it coming to you later as a healthcare provider. And you know that if the police get involved, there may be further harms down the road. Calling in police may also cause you to wonder what is the boundary between my medical ethics, my duty to the patient, and when I'm calling the police myself. And again, your fundamental need and duty to provide medical care now and in the future to the patient. Calling the police in circumstances also causes concerns for patients, right? So these range from discomfort. They are feeling that there's a breach of their privacy and confidentiality with their physician or provider. They may have a deep fear of police. They also may be afraid of arrest. There's also the potential for police violence. And all this may eventually lead to medical mistrust, which I know is a big concern in the medical community, especially where you're trying to get marginalized communities to access healthcare for public health reasons. So all of this is also to say that when you have workplace violence or workplace safety issues, this conjures up providers' dual loyalty. So like when you say dual loyalty, what do I mean? So a definition is the clinical role conflicts between professional duties to a patient and obligations express or implied to the interests of a third party, such as an employer, an insurer, or the state. Then you have the World Medical Association putting a little bit of a thumb on actually there's a primary duty or like an important duty to your patient and patient first. And so these comments, why do I bring up dual loyalty? Because the common scenarios are like when you have insurance issues, right? So like you're trying to provide medical care and the insurance isn't going to cover it. So what do you do? When you suspect the patient is a victim of abuse, or when you're asked to assist law enforcement with investigation, but in workplace violence situations, your loyalties to patient are in tension with concerns about your own safety and security, right? So how then do your medical ethics play into that? Now, so let's talk about some of these ethical implications. And I'm also going to say, like, I've given a lot of trainings on this topic specifically, and it's really hard. There is no silver bullet. And so part of what you may be feeling, sensing is that wanting from us is a clear answer. But a lot of this is about educating and also ruminating together about what it would be potential, the right solutions here. So let's start with ethics. So the core medical ethical principles, right? There's sometimes they add a fifth one about patient privacy, but patient autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. So the first one is about respecting patient autonomy, but if they are invading my sense of security and space, then how does this medical ethic play out? Beneficence, which is to act in the best interest of your patient, but how do you do that when perhaps you are in fear or mad at that patient? Non-maleficence is to do no harm, but how do you do that when you're also trying to prevent harm to yourself? And then justice, which is this notion of treating patients fairly and equally. And how do you not feel certain ways about a patient when you feel affronted, abused, or attacked? So those are some ethical implications that are at play at this very complicated intersection. There are also legal ones as well. And so I'm going to talk about three, and not to say that the healthcare industry, all you all are the most regulated people in terms of professions in the world. And so this is just three main buckets. This is not at all to say that this is the complete picture, but health privacy, right? So you have very firm health privacy laws, HIPAA, and then also state privacy laws that are similar to and perhaps stronger than HIPAA. And then what Professor Gardner went through is like constitutional rights. And why do we even mention these here? Because once police get involved, constitutional rights are in play, right? And what we mean is the Fourth Amendment right to be free from unreasonable government search and seizure, the Fifth Amendment right to maybe protect ourselves during police interrogations, and healthcare providers get involved in this depending on how you act with police. And then these constitutional rights also come up in tort liability cases. Let's say they're not so much in negligence actions, but in other kind of actions where your interactions or interplay with police may bring about causes of actions against the provider. And then lastly, and this is one that I'm going to concentrate more on in the third section, which is the hospital responsibility to provide you a safe workplace environment. And so these are workplace conditions under OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And so these are some of the implications that ethical and legal implications that are at play at this intersection. But there are other considerations too, and some of these are the next part that I'm going to are personal. So I'm going to delve into the implicit bias question that I alluded to in the Q&A. So I'm going to start with a scenario. So this is not like one of those Zoom things where you're going to. I think you just have access to the Q&A. I'm not asking you to put anything in the chat. I just want you to think about this. So I was recently doing an observation at an ED in a major metropolitan city, level 1 trauma facility. So a 38-year-old Black male is brought into the trauma bay by the police with a report of a stab wound. As the trauma team begins its examination, a nurse reports to the attending physician that the patient will not allow the treatment team to remove anything below the waist. So I just want you to think, just imagine for a second being on that trauma team and that's reported to you. And just think if any thoughts come to mind. You don't have to share those thoughts, just think about it. Now, what if you have another tidbit, which is another member of the team relays that the police told them that the patient will not talk about how he got stabbed or who stabbed him, right? So this is, the police are about to leave because this is what they deem an uncooperative victim. And so a victim who's not, so, and I want you now to take another second just to think about, well, what are some of the immediate reactions that you have? So, I'll tell you what I saw, observe, or transpire in this thing. So when the person came to say that the person would not remove something below the waist, this hospital had been talking a lot about whether they should put in some security measures, not just in the waiting room of the ED, but at the trauma bay entrance itself. And so this is the entrance where the ambulance is coming in. And so suddenly there was a concern, a heightened concern that was he carrying something below his waist that might be harmful to me, harmful to the team. And then when the second thing came out about that he wasn't being cooperative, you could sense that everybody that kind of confirmed everybody's feelings that maybe something was going on. So I'm obviously just an observer. I'm not a member of the team. I'm not dressed in, oh, I was dressed in scrubs, but you know, I was definitely not, nobody thought that I was a doctor. But you could sense a growing anxiety and apprehension. People were sort of starting to back away from him. It was also true that the trauma intervention, the immediate acute need was over, but nobody was approaching him to say how he was doing. There was sort of a fear there. And then you could also see from the patient side that he could start sensing it. His eye contact, he was starting to make eye contact with everybody. He was kind of nervous energy. And then you could see how things might have gone badly. Now, what actually ended up happening in this case is the next trauma came in, the trauma team moved to another thing, the guy was fine, and the whole situation diffused on its own. But I want you to think about what your reactions might have been or what you think could have been reactions by other people on your team, in your medical team. What are some ways in which a person's implicit bias may arise in this kind of scenario, right? So it's like Black male who's not removing his boxers. Maybe he has some contraband that he's concealed somewhere. Maybe it's a weapon. How might those biases affect the patient and the treatment care's approach to care team's approach to him and his medical care? So these are just with no clear answers, but just things to think about, because implicit bias, as you may know, involves attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, decision-making, and behavior without our even realizing it. So this is like below the surface, below the cognitive surface. And this is something we all have to contend with every day, especially in this diverse, non-homogeneous society that we live in. Implicit bias, again, functions automatically in ways that you wouldn't endorse if you had conscious awareness of this. And the thing is that we rely on these cognitive shortcuts to get by day to day, to filter information that we receive, to fill in missing data, categorize people and information according to cultural stereotypes. I mean, I will have to admit, and when I'm faced with a room full of 80 students, I start doing this kind of like filtering and categorizing. My brain just automatically does it, and it's very natural to who we are. Now, other thing, though, is that implicit bias thrives in certain kinds of environments, cognitively taxing, places with complex decisions under time pressures, imperfect information, and when decision makers are cognitively depleted, anxious or distracted, or the task is complex or decision is difficult. Does any of this sound familiar to you? I mean, when I was a public defender, which I know is different from being a medical provider, but I'm going to make the case that there's a lot of similarities, and there's a crossover to a healthcare scenario too. I used to run a really busy calendar. So I'd have to deal with 20 people who are coming off the street, and I had to tell them immediately then what their plea offer was. I'd never met them before. Can get the plea offer, convey it to them, decide whether they were going to take a plea or not, and then set it for calendar or whatever. And this was so I was doing this in the hallway, very quick discussions. I remember going up to every single, it was pretty automatic because the place where I was practicing, there were a lot of Spanish speaking people. And so the first question I would ask would be, do you need an interpreter? And so, it was just during the course of the question that I asked, and I would probably barely look up. I am not proud of those days. They weren't client-centered moments. And then one day I was very low on the totem pole. So I had county healthcare. So I had to go to my county doctor to go for my primary visit. So I go, sit in this waiting room. It's really crowded. It doesn't look very different from the courtroom that I just left. And then my primary doctor comes to me, and she also has a file. She doesn't look at my face. She just looks at my name, which is Ji Seon Song, which as you can tell, is not Anglo in any way. And the first thing she says to me is, do you need an interpreter? And I just completely, I was so offended. I was so offended. But then at that moment, I realized that these sort of implicit bias things that we don't even think about come up in the way we practice, in the way you administer medical care, in ways that you think might help you. I realized, I thought that was being both helpful to him and helpful to me, but that those could be incidents of implicit bias that someone might feel, and that can also affect the relationship that they have with me. And so turning again just to your scenario, so implicit bias in healthcare can result in, prioritizing cases, opinions regarding home environment, client counseling, evaluation of medical concerns, paternalism, your communication with the patient. And then lastly, I want to focus on perceptions of threatening behavior, right? So that I think is relevant to our discussion here of workplace safety. But I also want to talk about this point because I saw in the Q&A about how do you deal with someone who's coming off a meth high or who is completely tweaking, right? And also I want to say that is not so different sometimes from the public defender experience, especially when you go into certain places. But how do you differentiate implicit bias, what you're thinking, from your assessment based upon experience or health indicators, right? Or the exam that you've done. And I think that this is the difficult part to negotiate as a healthcare provider when you think about how you interact with patients, how that interaction may heighten the concerns of you and heighten the concerns of a patient who may be sitting and who may have, who knows what their situation was before they came into the healthcare setting. And maybe the healthcare setting is chaotic in a way that is beyond your control, but also then triggers a number of reactions on the patient's part. These are all considerations that you might have when you're that I want give you as toolkits, as tools to think about when you're deciding what to do. And again, I'm gonna turn to another category of things to consider. And again, the reason why we're focusing on the criminal justice system and policing is because of the profound consequences to both patient and provider here. And so Professor Gardner pointed out that, their prosecutorial discretion plays a role. And I just want to give you sort of a roadmap or sort of a list of what are the different ways in which arrests, police intervention may play out here. So you could have an arrest and no charge. So that is entirely possible. The police come in, they arrest, or they handcuff maybe, and then nothing happens, or they arrest, nothing happens. They can be arrested and released pending a criminal case. They can be arrested, detained in jail, and then charged. And then there's misdemeanors or felonies that can happen, right? So based upon the level of the seriousness of the conduct. Now, I just want to emphasize, just like Professor Gardner said, police intervention does not automatically mean that there will be a prosecution, but also to know that, let's say a case does get dismissed, and in there was one physician that I was talking to that works at a veterans hospital, and she was saying how their hospital security would routinely refer things to the police, but that the prosecutor almost always invariably dismissed them. Now, the thing is that there might be the dismissal, but the thing to also know is that the patient may still be in jail pending these decisions by the police or prosecution or the judge. And just to know that the criminal justice system is punitive largely in nature, even though there might be treatment programs or drug counseling that you might hear about in jails or through probation, it is largely a system that is geared towards punishment, and where your conceptions of care are really different than in jails and prisons and through any kind of carceral solution than what you might be thinking as a healthcare provider. Another really important thing to note is that police are not confined to intervene to address the immediate safety issue, right? So I always, police are given tools. Like, I will forever be a lawyer. I cannot undo the programming of a lawyer. Police are the same. Their primary task is to investigate, and it's really hard to turn off that investigating that task or the function that they have. And so police presence at the request of a medical provider to diffuse a situation may invite additional investigation. So they may arrest the patient for a charge as other, like it might turn into actually assault on a police officer or resisting arrest. Undocumented status may lead to referral to ICE. You might oftentimes the contraband that might be found on them could lead to a drug prosecution. They can interrogate them for other suspected crimes. They can recover patient property, which includes DNA that might be recovered, let's say, from patient clothes. And so the request to come into the healthcare setting has major implications for the constitutional rights of patients. And just to do a small pause and just some of the stats is that, when you think about drug enforcement, and we talk about the crossover between substance abuse and healthcare, drug use is I'm going to mention something about, in terms of policing specifically, which is drug use is shown to be equal across racial groups, yet studies show large disparities in the charging and prosecution among racial groups. So you'll see this in this slide here, which is the rates of drug use and sales by race, which you see here, and the dark green being Black, and then the light green being white. And then you see the rates of drug-related criminal justice interventions, right? So arrest, which is very highly disproportionate, and then you have incarceration, and then both state and federal. And lastly, I didn't have time to look to see if Michigan had any particular instances of this, but police presence may also exacerbate tensions and actually increase the level of violence, resulting in perhaps use of force and then death of the patient. So there was a really interesting article a few years ago about when the hospital fires a bullet, because it turns out a lot of the gun-related violent incidents in hospitals came from police officer guns, right? So like the security officers who are carrying guns, not necessarily patients who are bringing that stuff in. And there is also a correlation between police brutality, whether it occurs inside or outside healthcare settings, and mistrust in medical institutions. And so there is also other highly relevant to you reason to be concerned about police coming into the facility. Now, last sort of in this general bucket of information that I'm sort of throwing at you, which is, so how does health privacy, why should I be thinking about health privacy here? Okay, so there was an incident of workplace violence, and so I feel the need to call the police, but you are still the healthcare provider, right? So there are guardrails set in place about patient health information. Let's say when you do a mandatory reporting obligation, right? And so like the victim actually of the assault is a third party and not the hospital. The hospital happens to have medical information that is considered private and confidential. But what does it mean when it is the hospital or healthcare provider themselves who are making the report. Now, a report of a crime is an exception under HIPAA. So you have to remember, again, HIPAA provides a federal floor of privacy protections. But the information that's disclosed is specified under the HIPAA regulations. And this is also reflected in Michigan's APL about PHI, patient personal patient health information written authorization. And another, you have to also keep, so part of what I'm saying here is that HIPAA has a minimum necessary requirement. The minimum necessary requirement is also reflected in AMA Code of Ethics opinions when it comes to disclosure to law enforcement. And you have to think about how that relates to when you're the one who you yourself are making the report, because there are ways in which other patient health information that are beyond what should be disclosed may be used, because police are not generally covered entities under HIPAA, right? So they may be if they are also providing healthcare, but that is very few and far between. And so once PHI is in police hands, there are little or no guardrails on how they use that information. And so to sum up here, and I'm talking specifically here about a vulnerable population, people who suffer mental illnesses, maybe come from racial minority groups, who have substance abuse issues, who live in precarity, that there is now overwhelming evidence that we have this cycle, right? It's the cycle of like home or street, hospital setting, whether it's a clinic, ED, or some other kind of care, and then police and jail. And so part of the reason for this sort of overwhelming background that I'm giving to you in part 2 is to show you the extent to which there are consequences and implications on both sides. Now, this is also not to diminish from the fact that workplace violence is a serious issue. Just in response to a question that I saw in the prior Q&A, I think an important thing to note, and Professor Gardner, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that, police data or prosecution data has been collected for all these decades. I am not sure to what extent workplace violence data has been collected in the same kind of way through those decades, particularly since emergency medicine, which is as we listed the #1, really only came into existence as a formal specialty in the 1970s, which is decades later than when data first started being collected. And so I think it's important to think not so much like, it is absolutely an issue, but I also think that that's another thing to keep in mind when we're taking account the whole picture. So this part is called making the emergency department safer for patients and providers. And then after looking at this again just 2 seconds ago, I'm like, okay, this may make you think that we're coming up with a silver bullet or not, but we are going to come up with some ways to think through some solutions, because I think that we can do better, right, than what we have currently to break this cycle. And right now we have, as I said, overwhelming criminal justice system responses. So states have passed harsher criminal penalties for assaults on healthcare providers. So for example, in your state, Michigan passed laws just last year increasing financial fees for assault on healthcare workers and for posting signage at hospitals for of those increased penalties. Hospitals have brought in more police into their facilities. And I think I understand the impetus for these kinds of moves, but I am also going to say that and I'm going to, you'll see in a few minutes what I mean, but that these criminalizing legislation is much easier to pass on the political level than other kinds of things that take a lot more infrastructure and work. And so if you look at just this, if you think about, okay, what are the causes for workplace violence in the healthcare setting, then are things like increasing financial fees or posting signage actually going to be alleviating the problem, right? Because my question is, can we do better? Because if you think about, let's just take again the fees and the signage, it's like if you have a mental health emergency and that's one of the causes, do you think that increasing the financial fees is something that the patient is actually thinking through before they decide to act out? Patient boarding, I think, creates these kinds of anxiety-inducing situations. So again, even if there is a sign that says that there's increased penalties, I don't know necessarily if that's going to affect the patient behavior. And then it also, again, I think takes the onus off of institutions to think about what they need to do in order to make the place safer for nurses, doctors, nurse practitioners, because we know that mental health is a big issue, right? In our society in general, and that you as providers see it up front and personal. And the collateral consequences of police involvement, we know from just a conviction alone, it has all these like citizen stripping consequences. You get evicted from public housing, barriers to employment, disenfranchisement, you can't own a gun anymore. But even from just an arrest, there are soft forms of consequences here that you and maybe the social workers who work with you would know, which is you can lose housing, lose employment, there's interruption in your insurance because oftentimes you get kicked off of Medicaid, interruption in care and social services. And then there's this lingering but very important thing of then just contributing to this mistrust of healthcare providers and thinking that perhaps my healthcare provider is actually part of the police team. So, I'm listing these challenges here. So we have that law enforcement, this is our argument here, or my argument, that law enforcement intervention can exacerbate underlying conditions. Healthcare providers, on the other hand, feel a vital need, and they must be able to do their job safely and without fear. Hospital settings, especially those like safety net hospitals, serve vulnerable populations that they'll likely see. So they're repeat players, so repeat customers, so you will see them over and over again. So you need to retain their trust in order to give them the medical care that they need. So how do we support healthcare providers without perpetuating or contributing to additional harms? So I'm just looking at three kind of solutions as three buckets. So one is government intervention. Two is institutional and hospital administration responsibility, and three is the provider responsibility themselves. So let's just take government itself. So right now, pending in the House and the Senate is this proposed federal law, Workplace Violence Prevention for Healthcare and Social Service Workers Act. This is different from a law that criminalizes the conduct. What it does is requires OSHA, that I mentioned before, to create federal workplace violence and prevention standards that mandate employers, mandate hospitals and healthcare settings to develop comprehensive workplace-specific plans to prevent violence before it happens. It sets minimal requirements for standards, physical changes to the environment. The research has showed that physical changes to the healthcare setting itself rapidly or dramatically decreases the incidence of workplace violence. Staffing, again, as I mentioned, different specific or tailored kind of security measures, employments involved in the development of the plan, hands-on training, record keeping, so that it's not sort of like always reactive, but that you actually know if there's any patterns that are developing. Now, the thing is, this was stalled in the 2021 to 2022 session. It passed the House, stalled in Senate. Right now, it's currently pending in our House and Senate, but as you might know, as we all know, our federal government is sort of at a moment of transition right now. But that's not to say that this isn't possible. And I think that this is something that Michigan itself should take a look at, because this proposed federal law is based upon a California law that passed last year in 2023 and went into effect in 2024. So now it's hard to say what the impact is yet, right? But this law is something that states should implement. And I think and I looked it up, I don't see anything similar in the Michigan legislature, but that would do a lot to empower providers by saying, like, look, you hospital or you healthcare setting, we need to think about this not just as us providing care to people, but that we are a workplace that that our main mission is to provide care, but we are also workers together, and we have to think about the environment that you create for us. Now, this is the Joint Commission is mainly patient-centered, patient-facing, right, and not provider-facing. But in the absence of federal movement on this, they have also issued revised workplace violence and prevention standards that might be helpful for you. Now, what am I thinking in terms of the hospital? Well, regardless of whether there's like a federal or state mandate to do so, it's just to create an environment for healthcare workers to anticipate issues before the violence arises. When I was a practicing lawyer, I used to try to emulate providers, healthcare providers all the time, because you all have checklists for everything. You all have anticipated a million different scenarios and prepared for them. So why isn't that when you have the experience and the know-how of why these things occur, why couldn't hospitals more systematically anticipate these issues before we come to a moment of crisis? How can we, and so this is again, improving staffing levels, decreasing wait times for patient, increasing comfort and privacy in patient treatment areas. And there is research in the medical literature to back this up in small studies, address the problems of patient boarding, which has been a consistent problem that I know that hospital infrastructure is trying to address, which again is complicated, right, by the bottom line that financial bottom line that hospitals have to meet, and to develop guidelines, right, for healthcare providers so that you're not, and then you're in the middle of dealing with an important medical care issue that you're not supposed to, you're not having to sort of off the cuff problem solve this other issue. And then this is, I think, important, and also important for this, what we talked about, this other category of workplace violence between workers, that develop and nurture a culture of safety and open communication. So develop protocols for healthcare workers to report issues, to record and identify patterns for future solutions, staff trainings that actually talk about how to escalate, to recognize signs of escalation and how to employ de-escalation techniques, develop security solutions that take into account patient care. I was like talking to one hospital administrator once, and we we're just sort of like spitballing ideas, like what are ways for us to bring in security into a situation, or let's say like have Professor Gray, like she's in a moment of crisis, but also is not really sure, doesn't want to escalate the situation. Can we bring in security? And we're thinking, well, maybe it depends on what that person is wearing, right? Maybe that person doesn't necessarily have to identify as hospital security, but could come in as an additional body that would make Dr. Gray feel safe, but then wouldn't like heighten the tensions, heighten the sort of the fear and the other kind of escalating factors on the patient's part. So those are things that I think hospitals have to do work on, right? But what can individual providers do? And I think the first one is really similar, right? So, because you're the boots on the ground, you're the eyes on, you're the ones who would know, like, what are the patterns that you see? So like I was at another ED where there was definitely someone who was coming off from a very long, prolonged meth use. And so there were signs that showed that that person was someone that people should keep track of and keep eyes on. And I don't think it necessarily in this ED, they had a perfect answer to this, but that's an example of a common scenario that might come into the ED that you might need to address. When another hospital is like an elderly person who is perhaps in some stages of dementia. And so that was also causing a lot of anxiety and stress, and then ended up in that particular instance of like slapping the healthcare provider. But like, she was also like, you know, he was exhibiting signs of distress before. So what are ways in which we can pinpoint those before, recognize the role of implicit bias, and engage in longer term solutions? And then here, I just sort of listed out for you. So like, what kinds of violence and harms, what precipitates them? Do you think these would not occur if certain measures had been taken, et cetera, et cetera. So I sort of talked about that in the prior slide, but now let me turn to implicit bias. So I said that it's important for you to be able to negotiate the difference or recognize the difference between when you're making an actual measured, educated judgment of some kind of danger versus implicit bias. So here I am just focusing on the latter, which is like, if you how would you recognize and correct implicit bias? And so many of you may have done this before, but I'm just going to do a repeat, a recap here for which is, the first is to recognize that implicit bias may be playing a role, right? So to that man that I played, so one of the questions was, why did I mention that? Well, I was the race of the man and not of the nurses. I mean, it doesn't really matter, right? There were people of all sorts of races and ethnicities and genders there, but your implicit bias could manifest even if it's the same race to same race, right? But it's actually in those moments, it's even harder to recognize that maybe implicit bias is playing a role here. So the first thing is to just note, like, is that playing a role? Second is stereotype replacement. So what that means is you become aware of the stereotype you hold and you create non-stereotypical alternatives to replace them. So I'll give you a quick example, like Asian Americans are good at math. So then replace with the stereotype with like Asian Americans are not just about math and science, right? Counter stereotypic imaging is a different thing. So let's stick with the Asian American math person. So you have the stereotype, right? So I'm using the stereotype because I'm Asian American. It feels like sort of like an easy and like not contentious example here. But so you have the stereotype that Asian Americans are good at math and computers. So then think counter stereotypic imaging is thinking of that Asian American coworker or friend or family member who is terrible at it to help you counter that stereotype. Individuation is to see people as an individual and not a group. Like I remember when I was in college, I had this really contentious issue with one particular group of people, and you know, they were older than me, and I just remember like in an instance like that, then I'm like, okay, all seniors are going to be mean, right? Like seniors in college, like here I am a freshman, but this idea of like, oh, actually, that's just I was experiencing. Not all seniors are just one monolithic group, but people are individuals. And so to sort of take out that kind of group thinking and to individuate, to give yourself perspective taking. So imagine the perspective of someone from a group different from you. So this is like putting yourself in another person's shoes. And so this is another way to sort of recognize and correct implicit bias. And then increase opportunities for contact. So the studies have shown like the more that you have contact with people from different ethnicities, racial groups, or than where you come from, that this also is important in addressing implicit bias. And then I think emotional regulation is also very important in the healthcare setting, where you might have a fast-paced sort of environment where it's hard for you to think mindfully, like I have that mindfulness at the very end, but it's just to take a moment to reflect on your gut feeling and to be and to just be aware that perhaps like your the emotion that you're experiencing is something that's like instinctive and reactive instead of one that really should be present at that moment. And so lastly, so I want to say before we break out for Q&A is that what has been really interesting for me in this work is getting to know physicians, nurses, nurse practitioners all across the country who are working on this, who are sort of understanding this tension. One, I need to do my job. My job is really hard. I have coworkers that are leaving the job because it is getting harder. And then the tension between that and like wanting to create a safer work environment for themselves with this knowledge that this mass incarceration criminal justice system that we have is perpetuating all these harms on the same kind of patient population that you're seeing. So work not just with your administration on developing and formalizing changes, let your voice be heard with legislators. I mean, that's the, you know, coming as like a former Ph.D. public defender, there is nothing, when I would look at doctors with such envy, doctors and nurses with such envy, because you have such a more powerful political voice, right, than I would. And I think that there's a lot that physicians can do to really press these issues, and not just in terms of criminalizing conduct, and then engage with professional organizations. So I know that ASAP in particular is working on law enforcement related issues. The ANA has really come out full force for this federal workplace legislation. And then there's also other kinds of groups. So I'm a part of this group called the Healthcare Law Enforcement, it's like a really long acronym. It's called HELIP. Anyway, it's like, you know, physicians, nurses, social workers, violence prevention workers, legal academics from all across the country that are brainstorming on ideas about this. So I think that these are all important ways that you can do, even, I mean, I know this seems like additional work, but it's not really, because it's really your experiences that will spark the change that's needed, that you can't just have some, you know, higher up in administration or in the legislature make these decisions that only you know intimately, and that you can, the solutions have to come from you.